So, hello everybody. Welcome our 155th Reading Online Sports Economics Seminar. It was supposed to be Joel today presenting, but unfortunately he has been unable to. And so it so happens that I have something that I've presented recently. So I thought I'd plug that into the gap. And also it's been a long time since I did, and I've been on the other end. I've been the one inviting everyone for a long time to do these things. So I figure I should just remind myself what it's like to be the person doing the presentation. Before we start, I will actually just start sharing my screen, and folk interrupt me if window, don't I? Interrupt me if you have questions at any point, if something's not clear. I might not be able to see what's going on. But yeah, so I'm going to present something which is something that a few members of the group have seen fairly recently. Anyone that was at the first Latin American Sports Economics Association conference. Sorry, Latin American Sports Economics Conference. I don't know if there's an association yet. Maybe Jorge's working on that next. Or if you happen to be in Maynooth, where Alex Farnell is, you'll have heard stuff related to this recently. But what I've titled it is How Much Can We Learn from the Long History of Matchday Attendances in English League Football? If folk can let people in, also that'd be really useful, just to minimize the disruption on my own computer. I'm not sure how much my computer can cope these days. But a few bits of information before we really get going. You may have noticed in the email reminder, I pointed out a notice from the Women in Sports Economics Management and Sociology website or group, which is headed up by Pamela Vicker and Katrine Scharfenkamp in Bielefeld in Germany, and they're keen to put together a membership list to enable visibility of female scholars in the field of sports economics. It doesn't take long to look at the list of presenters over the 155 seminars that I've organised to see that it's there's not much balance, and so the things that we can do to encourage balance, to encourage the visibility of female scholars in the field, is a really good thing. So you may not be a female scholar yourself, but if you do know some of your groups, wherever you happen to be, do pass on to them the WISEMs, I don't know how you might say, but the Women in Sports Economics and Management members list. The link is there and it's in the reminder I sent out earlier on. In terms of deadlines that I want to flag up, in particular the deadline for the conference that we're organising in Reading in May. I talked with quite a few of you about this. Hopefully it'll be a good gathering. It's also joint with the Sports Economics Sports Management Conference, which often happens around that time of the year. We'll be in Reading, May 7th and 8th. Colin Camera from Caltech will be a keynote speaker. But the most pressing thing is the abstract deadline is February the 29th. I haven't put the link that you should follow into here, but it should be, if you scroll back in the chat, if you can see the chat, or if you look at the reminders I've sent out, you should be able to find the link for submitting. Similarly, a few more weeks, and we've got the deadlines for the ESEA, European Sports Economics Association Conference in Rotterdam, organised by Thomas Peters and Jan van Oers. And at the same day, the deadline for the workshop associated with a special issue of Frontiers in Behavioural Economics, headed up by Raphael Flepp, Carl Singleton and Romain Goyo. So if you do want to, if you're considering submitting to that and want to attend their one-day workshop in Zurich, March the 15th is your deadline. And then we've got the Ibero-American Conference on Sports Economics in Madrid in the summer. March 22nd is the deadline for that conference. And then the final one I've got listed here is another Spanish conference that many are familiar with, which is the conference in Gijón, where April 1st is the deadline for that. Okay, so I'm presenting work that is fairly purely sports economics. I'm not going to try and claim some great broader significance. Obviously, sport gives us sport is significant in and of its own right, but this is a kind of a body of work that I've kind of chipped away at over the years purely out of interest as much as anything. But obviously, because there are all sorts of interesting hypotheses within the sports economics field regarding interest in the sport, demand, supply. There are all sorts of things that that remain interesting, and obviously the one that tends to be talked about most commonly is the uncertainty of outcome hypothesis, traced back to the very first papers in the field. The idea being that fans prefer more uncertainty in sporting events that they attend. And with a lot of these kinds of things, when economics are like a puzzle, it's not clear that the evidence really backs that up, certainly at the match level. I've only put one link there, and there's plenty of work that's been done to look at the uncertainty of outcome hypothesis. But a lot of the studies that look at the kind of the individual game level tend to find that it's other factors that appear to matter, and that the central prediction of the uncertainty of outcome hypothesis, that demand would be maximized where uncertainty is highest, so some kind of inverted U shape, doesn't tend to be found, so as a result, papers by Brad Humphreys, Dennis Coates over recent years have tried to introduce, or at least add some structure to the modelling, such that we might be able to explain a little bit more aspects of the behaviour that we observe. My data set is purely attendances, and that's often been the unit of analysis, though not exclusively. People have looked at television viewing figures and other sources of information to measure fan interest. But the papers by Coates and Humphreys and Zhao developed a model where the home win preference, the fact that fans will turn up hoping for a win. I'm actually going to go and watch my team tomorrow, and I really actually hope they win. It would be nice to be there, but I really hope they win, and I don't want to see an uncertain game. I also have, I'm sure many people have a wearable device that measures your heart rate and stress levels. Without fail, my stress levels are maximized when I'm watching my team play, so I prefer matches that aren't stressful. A nice 5-0 win would be nice tomorrow. Within that model also, the idea of loss aversion is developed, that the dissatisfaction from losing is more than the satisfaction from winning. And of course, there's also a preference for quality as well that fans display. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at lots of numbers of attendances. People have paid over the years, many decades, to watch football at different levels in England, and try and construct explanatory variables based around these different explanations, and see how much we can learn from that vast amount of data. And as a teaser, we don't seem to find much support for this match level uncertainty of outcome hypothesis. In fact, not any, at least last time I checked. I reran the regressions and put them in the slides, so it's a little bit of a reveal when I get there, as well as when we get there together. But I've not found much support, if any, for the uncertainty of outcome hypothesis at the match level. But there is evidence for broader competition level dimensions of uncertainty. It isn't just the match itself that matters. The competition level of uncertainty, whether the team that you're following has the chance still to reach some of the prizes, or avoid some of the lesser rewards that come at the end of a football season. So as mentioned, my source is football in England, league football. So football in England has gone back further than 1888, but that's when the Football League was formed. That's roughly the timeline. The Football Association was founded in 1863. The FA Cup played in 1871. The Football League was created in 1888. Another competition called the Combination was formed at the same time, with different clubs that weren't included in the Football League. That failed. The next year became the Football Alliance. And 3 years down the line, the Football Alliance became the second division of English football and promotion and relegation began. It's important to say that while I've often we kind of envisage European sport as this bastion of promotion and relegation and open competitions rather than closed competitions, the Football League itself, whilst it became pretty big pretty quickly, there was no relegation out of the Football League until 1986. So in 1986 is when promotion and relegation out of the Football League began. Just one team, the worst team. Prior to that, there was an election system, so it was very much a closed system. Further back, though, and some of you will have seen Pat Massey present on the Southern League, because the Football League was primarily a northern endeavour, and the south was somewhat ignored. And the Southern League began in 1894, appears to have flourished. Southern League teams won the FA Cup in 1901, and in 1900 and 1902 they reached the semi-finals of the FA Cup, so they were competitive. But eventually they were absorbed into the third division, so they were absorbed as pretty inferior members of the Football League when there was eventually a merger, as there often is in the rival league context. But that was also 26 years after the league was formed as well, so this was a very long-lasting rival league. The league has had 92 teams playing in 4 divisions since basically sometime not long after 1920. It became 88 teams in 1921. And then in 1992, not on this list because it shows perhaps my focus as a consumer of sport, the Premier League was formed in 1992, a rather large development in the English footballing landscape, diverting more resources or affecting the distribution of resources firmly away from lower division teams and firmly to the teams right at the top in the Premier League. So there's a website, English Football League tables.co.uk, beautiful website with all these numbers. Each dot is a attendance in a football match, in a league football match. Actually, because that's going to be 1875, so it might be that some of the early FA Cup matches are included in this. But either way, lots and lots of dots for lots and lots of football matches. The red dots is this Southern League that formed, and you can see that the attendances were in and around the Football League ones, not necessarily at the top, but not necessarily at the bottom either. These are attendances by competition. The Premier League, as it is now, is the black, and that was the first division. The red line is Division 2, which in these first 3 seasons was the Football Alliance, and there's an argument that that wasn't necessarily progressing particularly well, and hence it was absorbed as the second division of the Football League, after which things picked up, certainly in terms of numbers of people willing to watch. This orange line is the Southern League, and so you can see that the attendances were competitive with the second division of the Football League, yet when it was absorbed, it became the third division, which is this blue line here. You had a third division south, and a third division north, where you can see a clear distinction in the southern matches being more popular. At this point, it simply became 4 divisions based on a hierarchy rather than having a regional competition. So that's the context. That the Football League expanded very quickly. There's stuff here about the Southern League, which isn't necessarily particularly relevant to what I'm looking at, other than the fact that the Southern League is included in the mass of data that I'm looking at. So it isn't just the Football League. I put this slide in every time we've given this talk, and usually skipped over it, but I think it's worth. For a few reasons, I'll stop and just talk through the slide, not least because at least one of the papers here was presented in a Rose's seminar a little while back. Sport, as we like to argue, is a networking activity and brings people together. One of the interesting aspects, I think, of English football that I kind of observed, especially having had a recent trip to Ireland, is that it developed almost completely over a period when there was unrest on the island of Ireland, with independence for Ireland coming in 1921 from the United Kingdom, and then troubles in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, which kind of culminated in a huge terrorist attack in Manchester during the European Championships in 1996, which was in England at the time. And in fact, that terrorist attack, a large bomb in the centre of Manchester, was the day before a match in Manchester at Old Trafford, which did go ahead. And so football and sport often exists within difficult, tense situations where people aren't getting along, and there are attacks of different types. The paper that I mentioned with Michael Jetta presented it in the Roses series, where he presented how the Colombian government placed messages during football matches aimed at rebels, which, according to from their results, was a successful policy. And there's been a few other papers related to this broader interaction between, or sport nestled within difficult circumstances. But the main thing I would emphasize in wrapping up this particular slide is Alex is here, and his common refrain is "make sport, not war." And obviously we're at a time when military activity appears to be increasing, and with
they don't listen to me.
I'm not sure about that, Alex. I'm not sure about that. But thank you for your contributions as always. So back to I'm not going to include much. I did actually play around with military conflict information in this model, because the United Kingdom has been involved in lots of military conflicts over the period between 1888 and the present day. And so I've downloaded a bunch of different data sets on that, but so far no clear findings. An aside is that this season here is the season 1914-1915, which began at the start of the First World War, and football didn't stop in England until 1915. But you can see that one of the commercial reasons to stop was the fact that the attendances dropped like a stone, 30–40% lower gates during the First World War, and football was eventually abandoned. Okay, so back to the content of the paper. We're modelling attendances. I'm basing it within the context of the model that Brad and Dennis have developed, which is primarily a demand side model. What motivates people to go and attend, an expected utility framework. It is worth, of course, at least a nod to the fact that football was developing in England over this period. One of the criticisms of using attendance data is that stadiums often reach their capacities. And for much of English football's history, and it's still the case now, capacities don't tend to be hit very much. Certainly in the pre-1990 period after the Second World War, stadiums were vast, and especially into the 80s. You can see that attendances were falling, and stadiums were vast. There were social issues with hooliganism and so on. So capacities weren't necessarily an issue, but obviously at the start here, capacities would have been an issue. This is the point when teams are developing ways of excluding people so that they can charge entry and charge them to watch the game, and hence count the number of people that have turned up and watched this game. So I'm not at all, other than mentioning it now, thinking about the supply of football, but it's very much a relevant factor here. As I've made clear, it's a match level analysis rather than a kind of an annual or seasonal level analysis, which is what often the longer term analyses are. And I'm not doing that because I think the match level is the right level necessarily. Matches add match level, or disaggregation must add noise as much as it necessarily adds signal and informativeness. But I think there's enough that we can develop at the match level that I kind of want to work at that level, at least for now, and then perhaps aggregate and think about what passes along, what can be learned as we pass along. So I think about outcomes of football matches. An important thing to note is that Brad and Dennis's papers are set up for sports that don't have tied outcomes. I'm not really sure to the extent that that matters, in the sense that if I go and watch a game, especially if I'm going to the game tomorrow, I really care only about my team winning. And the home win effect applies if the home team wins, and if there's a draw tomorrow, for me, that's almost as, I'm not sure there's much better. It's that much better than having lost. So I'm not totally sure. I've not really thought much more than that about the issue. But the model is set up where you have a utility from you seeing your team win, and that utility is specifically made up of a bunch of different components. This term here, which is positive, is the utility gained from the fact that your team wins. We propose there's some uncertainty of outcome effect, which is measured by some probability of the home team winning, and this is a function that is maximized at 0.5, so the home team win is a probability of 0.5. That's obviously a bit high if you're thinking about probabilities of outcomes in football matches, since the draw exists, and the draw usually happens on about 20 to 25% of occasions. So, a 0.5 home win probability is a strong home win favourite. Nonetheless, for now, that's the measure that's there. LS stands for league standing, the league standing effect, which is another of these terms from the Walter Neal paper, where the churn in the league standings, the fact that the league table's changing all the time, generates some interest. And if everyone was staying in the same position all the time, perhaps we'd be less interested. We wouldn't be inclined to go along and watch the game. This term here brings in the idea that when the team wins, fans gain some beta 1 in positive utility over and above what they expected. And then there's a quality effect as well. We like to see high quality. And then finally, the alpha 0 is that kind of being there term. I was there, I saw it all happen, all the other stuff associated with being at a sporting event. If the team doesn't win, and we've got a different utility, different level of utility down here, which is exactly the same as the utility from winning. It just doesn't have the home win term. I should also say there's a idiosyncratic term here as well to capture the fact that different fans have differing levels of happiness from different outcomes. But the idea is that we've got some kind of structure here in terms of fans derive this much from being at the game, this much from the home win, this much from uncertainty, league standings, and so on. And so you can pull this together as Brad and Dennis's papers do to get us a model of attendances. So log attendance on the left-hand side in P and P squared, collecting terms together. They add in, because obviously if you're thinking about the optimization problem for the fan, there's the price of the ticket matters in terms of making that calculation about whether to attend or not. And then they've added in also, well, I shouldn't say added in, but separated out the quality of team I, the quality of team J, and other match day characteristics. And I put in this here. This isn't in their model, or at least I think it's in their expressions of their models. Other stuff, basically, and I'll talk through some of it in a little while. There's other stuff that arguably matters for match outcomes or match attendance outcomes. So that's roughly speaking what the model looks like. There's a few more things to think about. But in terms of identifying the effects that we're interested in, the uncertainty of outcome hypothesis is particularly identified if this coefficient gamma 2 is negative. And so that's what we've got listed here, that you have the gamma 1 coefficient on the probability positive, the gamma 2 coefficient on the squared probability negative, and then also this additional term. But most fundamentally, gamma 2 determines whether the uncertainty of outcome hypothesis dominates or loss aversion amongst fans, the idea that they hate defeats more than they like wins. And now that we've got the model, we need to think about ways in which we're going to measure all of these various terms that are in there. The attendance might seem obvious. It's the numbers that I've got collected from this website. I believe they're reasonably reliable. In the sense that they are the numbers released at the time by the football clubs, then logged with the Football League, because the Football League collected information for a long time in order to operate a small amount of revenue sharing, as was the case up to the mid-1980s in the English Football League. But of course, there's almost certainly scope for measurement error. Dominic Schreier has done a lot of interesting work on empty seats and the difference between the number of people that buy a ticket and eventually show up. Some teams are known for releasing the number of tickets sold. Arsenal are famous for that, rather than the number of people that are in the stadium. I know from experience at my team that's varied as to whether they release the number of people in the stadium or the number of people that sold tickets. So there's certainly potential for measurement error there. I don't have information on ticket prices. This information on ticket prices, well, information on attendances is vast in English football, but information on ticket prices less so. Between about 1925 and the 1990s, there's information on gate receipts, so you can get an average price paid. And from the Dobson and Goddard textbook, they have a index separated by the first, second, third, fourth divisions, giving a kind of a ticket price index. And I've used that a little bit. I've not included it in the regression models I present here, because when I've tried to include that, obviously I'm cutting my sample down significantly in the first place, but also simple thing, the results so far don't make much sense when I do that. So I've not included that in today's presentation, but there is some limited information on the price of entry. Probability of a home win. Commonly bookmaker prices are used for this, as it turned into probabilities one way or another. That works for samples where you've got bookmaker prices for all the matches. Obviously, if we want to go back to 1888, that's not going to work. And so what I've got, and I've got some slides a bit later on, is I generate a statistical model to give me a prediction of the probability of a home win. There's a point related to the structural model, which is that the fan reference point, in terms of whether fans expect a home win or not, isn't necessarily the same as the probability of a home win, but we assume it is, that fans are, I guess, rational agents. And there are studies, Tim Pawlowski has a study looking at fan predictions or fan perceptions of outcomes. But suffice to say, here we've used a statistical model, which I'll talk about in a little while. The league standing effect that's in there. In the Humphreys and Zhao paper, they talk about using rank changes and absolute rank changes. That is, how many changes has there been recently in the league standings. What I use is a measure of that. I think it's absolute changes, but basically I use the number of changes in the league position in the week before a game to try and proxy the idea that there's still some churn in the league standings, and that might generate some interest amongst fans. There are, of course, all much broader competitive intensity type questions, and the competitive intensity rather than competitive balance literature has developed quite a lot over the last couple of decades. The idea being that there's more than just the championship to be worried about or to be concerned about as a football fan. You might be concerned about European qualification. You might be concerned, if you're in a lower division, about qualification for the playoffs. You might be worried about your team being relegated as well. And so what I do, to some extent, stuck in that X of other stuff, for want of necessarily thinking about where it might fit better, I've included information on the relationship of teams to these particular prizes or things to be avoided. And what we end up with is a pretty big model, and I haven't even finished talking about the variables because there's a whole extra slide here. But there are a lot of aspects, a lot of things that we could potentially use to explain the number of people that are turning up week on week in these different parts of England over 150 odd years, 140 odd years. And one of the things that must matter, I guess, is the cost of attending relative to income. And so as well, we don't have the price, but we do have the difference between the teams taking part. And so this must affect how expensive it is for fans of the visiting team to attend the game. I've also included the number of days between the last home match and this home match, and for the away team, the last away match and this away match. Dennis has a nice paper where he uses fixed effects for the away team to get a sense of the size of the away crowd. I've got some work with Brad and Carl where we look at the numbers that are released these days by football teams on the number of away fans in the stadium and the effect that they have. Obviously, don't have that as far back as 1888, but you can imagine that even though away fans only make up 10 to 15% of the attendance, that the length of time since their last match is going to matter. Scheduling, day of the week, is it a midweek game? Is it the holiday period? Christmas or Easter are big periods in the footballing calendar. In fact, I've got a double, basically referred to the time between the last match twice there. And also a quirk of the English calendar is that for many years there were repeat fixtures where one team would play the same team and then play them again in the repeat fixture immediately afterwards, rather than as is now when the two fixtures are separated by many other fixtures in the calendar. That's something that historically happened at festive periods where a team would play one team on Christmas Day, then play them again at the other venue, home and away, the next day, Boxing Day or New Year's Day. And then in terms of habits and persistence, kind of you imagine the number of people turning up might be a function of recent results. If the team's won recently, maybe more fans turn up. Teams in better form, maybe more fans turn up. If they're in bad form, maybe fewer turn up. And so we can include recent results, and we can also, I guess, get a broad measure. And we're definitely not the first person to do this, but I've included the lagged attendance to be a measure of kind of habit persistence, how persistent our attendance is in football. And that's, roughly speaking, the size of the data set. See, there's a little bit of a difference between the total number of matches with attendance and the total number of matches in the data set in total. And the difference will be that we've got attendance numbers for the actual league matches, but we've also got in there cup matches, and in particular FA Cup matches, where we don't have the attendance for them. But we're focusing on the league matches, of which we've got in total about 300,000. When we start to try and include some of the other bits of information, we sometimes end up losing some attendances. I've got geolocation for the location of a club and hence calculating the distance. But that isn't necessarily perfect in the sense that only 337,000 of the 429,000 do have a definite distance, and I don't know for sure without looking at what that means in terms of a fraction of the 306,000 have that. Move on to it in a moment, but this is our forecast of the probability of a home win. You can see that the forecast on average is 48%, which is close to 50%, but it's not 50%. Over time, 49% of football matches end in a home win. with 24% draws and 27% away wins. So it gives you a sense that the draw is an outcome that matters and has mattered historically in football. So I mentioned that I need to have a probability, and I can't use bookmaker prices because I have bookie information back to 1888, unfortunately. And so I put together a probability, a forecast model. The reason why I've called it an ordered multinomial logic probability model is because I can't remember actually off the top of my head which one it is, but having looked at all of them, and I found that the outcomes from changing them over, from assuming that the football match outcome, this variable, from assuming it's ordered from 0 to 0.5 to 1, from the way the goals go in a football match, or assuming it's multinomial, having a logic or probit doesn't really make too much difference. The main point is to construct a model based on relevant information, and so we calculate ELO ratings for all teams throughout time. So we go back to the start, and the team begins in 1888 or before. And we calculate ELO ratings for all teams, which gives us an ELO prediction, which we then use to allow for any kinds of distortions, whether it doesn't necessarily factor in the home win as much as it should. We then look at the share of points per game. So we scale the points per game by the home team divided by the sum of the two, because that's what all of these share variables are: the share of points per game, the share of form, and the share of goal difference per game. So just additional measures to kind of get some sense over and above, if necessary, what information we get from ELO ratings. And then got some fixed effects, which I can't remember off the top of my head, but probably include the home team and the away team. And we also allow in this model the coefficients to vary by decade. I've got actually a plot of that's the proportion of home wins and how they've varied over the years. So you can see that home wins were more like 55% of the time, dropping to about 45% of the time more recently. Draws increased in the 1960s and have been steadily decreasing since. And away wins have become more likely. So it's useful to allow the effects, or at least to allow the model parameters to change through time. Are these forecasts any good? Because obviously we then use this model to then say, well, this is our prediction of each match outcome. Are these fitted values, if you like, any good? And this is the answer. The answer is, so basically this is our model's probability of a home win, and this is the proportion of the games that ended as a home win. The same for a draw, probability of draw, games that ended in a draw, proportion of games that ended in a draw within each category. So, you've got all the games that we had a 0.6 probability of the away win, and did 60% of those games end as a draw. As you can see, when it comes to the away win, it's slightly higher. So there's a little bit of a departure up there away from the 45-degree line, where you might hope to see things kept. But by and large, when we get these deviations from the 45-degree line, it's because there aren't many observations. There aren't many away teams that have a probability of 60% or higher to win a game, and equally there aren't that many home teams with an 80% or greater probability of winning. So that's how we calculate our probabilities. In the Humphreys and Chow paper, there's a really important part about correcting the bookmaker probabilities for the fact that they are essentially a function of three things, namely, so that's the simplest way to put it. They're a function of the quality of both teams and of the uncertainty of the match. And so if we want to include measures of the quality of teams, and we want to include the probability, and have there not be this multicollinearity, and identify the particular effects, we want to try and separate these things. And so what we do is we follow the Humphrey-Chow method, and we regress our probabilities on the measures of quality that we include in the model, and then we use the residuals, so what are called lambda, lambda IJT, rather than the probabilities in the model. What do we use for this quality measure? The quality measure we use is the actual league position of the teams. And the rationale for that is that, yes, I can calculate, and this is a bit like the Tim Pawlowski paper on fan perceptions, but I can calculate my complex measure of ELO ratings, corrected for, goal difference, and recent form, and so on. But by and large, fans will identify whether they want to go to a game based on the league position. How high are my opponents? How high am I in the league? So that's basically the rationale. That's so the measure of team quality in the model is the league positions, and then when we're constructing the probabilities, we're using a more sophisticated way of doing that, and then we're separating the two out. And so that's our final model, where we corrected the probabilities and the probability squared, and we've got everything else in there, obviously minus the price, but we've got things that kind of proxy the cost of attending. We can estimate this model over the whole period, 1888 through to 2023. But also, we might be interested in how things have changed over time, because surely they have. I've talked about all sorts of ways in which things have changed over time. And so what I do to get an insight onto this for the time being is I run regressions on 20-year time intervals. So I'll show you a table in a second and zoom in on the numbers so that they're visible, where you've got 1888 to 1908 and 1908 to 1928 and so on through to the present day. Regressions every 20 years, and you get some sense of how things are changing. And then I've run some rolling regressions as well, where I've literally said, okay, from 1888 we estimate 20 years on, and then just keep moving that forward week by week. I think month by month through to the early 2000s. There are fixed effects for the season, the home team, the away team, the day of the week for that scheduling effect, the month of the season, and the competition the game's in, because obviously we've got a hierarchical system of 4 divisions plus a 5th division in more recent years. And the standard errors are clustered at the season and home team level. And so that's the really small table. Let's see if we can make it a bit bigger. So as mentioned, what I've done here, I can go a bit bigger, there we go. What I've done here is I've stuck in, this is the regression with all 140 odd years of observations, and then this is my 1888 on 1908 to 1928, 28 to 48, 48 to 68, 68 to 88, 88 to 2008, and then the last 15 years. But then we've got the lag. The lag of attendance is what this first line is, so that's the persistence effect. And then these aren't ordered particularly well, but if we're thinking about things like the uncertainty of outcome hypothesis, then this is our forecast. This is our P, probability of a home win. I'm not going to click on that again. Probability of a home win here. And then this is over the entire period, and this is the squared term over the entire period. And over the entire period, neither are actually significant, which is interesting. And the probability is slightly negative, and the squared term is positive, which suggests an inverted U shape. So no support for the uncertainty of outcome hypothesis, and instead of suggesting that loss aversion dominates. Then if we look at these time periods, so we've got the very early days when supply of football stadium space might have been an issue. There may have been capacity constraints. And then at this point, we see, again, insignificant coefficients, but at least the squared term is negative, suggesting to some extent uncertainty might have been somehow a very minor level, a concern of interest. But from then on, you can see that the coefficient is positive, generally significant, although getting smaller in recent years, so only 0.594 in the period from 2008 to the present day. All sorts of other, as I mentioned, all sorts of other terms in here to potentially scale up the regression, but also to kind of capture changes in preferences and what can we learn about fan preferences, fan decisions, fan actions over such a long period of time. Position changes, that's the league standing effect. And you can see that the league standing effect is generally, the term is positive, generally significant, saying that additional churn in the league standings does generate more interest and fans do turn up. So there is some sense there that the league standing effect is as might be expected. And then competitive intensity aspects. What I've put down here is whether the team was still in contention to finish in first place, the home team that is, whether the away team was still in contention to finish in first place, whether the home team can be relegated. Not put that in for the away team, and this one is in contention for 6th place. You might ask why 6th place. In lower divisions, that matters, roughly speaking, for qualifying for an end of season playoff competition to be promoted. You can think in the Premier League about it roughly proxying being in there and thereabouts for qualification for European competitions. But what you find is that the threat of relegation appears to galvanise support a little bit, at least in more recent decades. With a positive term, if the team can be relegated, the tendencies are a bit higher. On the other hand, of course, it might just be that fans give up once the team has been relegated. Contention for the championship, you see it matters quite equally for both teams, so perhaps fans of the home team are more interested if the visiting team is in contention for the championship as well. And that effect was perhaps strongest in earlier time periods, falling away, but still significant in more recent times. I've included a whole bunch of other things in terms of whether the team was promoted the previous season, whether the team was relegated the previous season, which you might imagine have an effect and may lend into thinking about the analysis of promotion and relegation, which papers by Roger Knoll and others, Jeremy Spear, have looked at in more recent years. And you can see that promotion in the previous season still leads to a boost in attendances. So over the whole period, 8%, roughly speaking. Again, as with other aspects of attendance, it appears the effect is smaller these days, only 5%, whereas it was 10, 12, 15% in previous times. Matches in the holidays generally, as you might imagine, lead to larger crowds. But again, this is declining quite dramatically. So very early days, 50% higher gates or thereabouts, 35, 40%, 35%, but then down, and now only about a 5% increment on gates. Positional changes. So no, I've not looked at that, but the position of the team, the position that the team is in, the home team and the away team, it's negative. So the lower is the number, first place, the better is the team. And so the coefficient's negative, as would be expected. And at each extra position, what's that, about 1% on the gate. But again, this is falling in more recent times as well. So sensitivity of fans appears to be falling. Whether the team won or lost the last game, you can see losing the last game does decrease the tendencies, but again, it's a decreasing effect to the extent that it's not very significant by the most recent 15 years. Even winning a game, you know, in 48 to 68, that gave you an extra 5% of fans, 6%, 68 to 88, but now it's maybe 2% of fans. A final thing just to say that I put in here was the new manager effect. Does sacking a manager have an effect on revenues coming in through the gates? To perhaps one of the justifications about why clubs should dispense with their manager. And here, this is one thing that is actually increasing in more recent times. So between 88 and 2008, you've got 3% if the new manager has been installed in the last 10 games, and that's down to about 1% in the most recent 15 years. That's the uncorrected version, if you like, without correcting for the quality effect on the outcomes. You can also correct for it, and that's what this table is. And what you can see is this slight, well, I suppose, interestingly enough, when you correct for the full sample, so E fork is our forecast corrected, and that's the forecast corrected squared. Over the whole time period, it is actually negative. So some evidence in favor of the uncertainty of outcome hypothesis. Interestingly, though, as you can see, it's not actually positive in any of the sub-time periods, which is somewhat interesting and something for me to go away and have a look at. But that's when we correct. Most of the other coefficients, when I've looked at them in past iterations, have been very similar between the corrected and the uncorrected model. I'm not going to be able to get back because I've not scaled the size of this table. So I will just have to quickly skip back through a whole load of slides to get back to there. So that's that was the correct in the forecast, which I'm not going to look at again, but you can see that there's some potentially interesting results there. As I mentioned, I've run rolling regressions because obviously you can just look at those separate chunks, but maybe it's interesting to look at each point as you go along and see how things have been varying. The red, so the blue, so the black even is the coefficient on the probability of the home win, and red is the probability of the away win. Sorry, on the probability squared. And so this being positive or negative tells us whether loss aversion or uncertainty of outcome is dominating. You see in those early years, close to zero, but then this loss aversion picking up. The minimum or maximum point is this blue line for the probability, and so you can see that the what is it? It's a positive coefficient, isn't it? So therefore, it's a minimum point. The minimum point has been dropping over time. Now it's somewhere, I guess, about 25%. The home win preference is the green line, and the home win preference is gamma 1 plus gamma 2 coefficients added together. You see that this tipped into being a positive coefficient after 1960, and there's quite a bit of work by sports historians looking at the development of fan culture, particularly in the post-war era, which is somewhat consistent with this idea of an emerging home win preference and perhaps more stable preferences amongst fans for the home teams. When I correct those forecasts, things look a bit different, a little bit more hard to make sense of, but nonetheless. And so here again, the same color scheme. Black is the gamma 1 coefficient on the probability, and the red one is the coefficient gamma 2 on the squared probability. And so you can see again, it's positive much of the time, with a significant jump up here after the Southern League joined the Football League in 1921. And that means that the home win preference developed much earlier on. If we separate out the quality from the uncertainty captured by the probability of a home win, and the point at which the implied minimum maximum you can see is outside the unit interval, 0 and 1 there, and so that is outside the unit interval. So just simply saying that it's non-linear, and it's non-linear in the unit, in the range of where the actual probabilities will be. We can look at others of those coefficients, talk through them in the table. Winning and losing games mattered more, matters less now. League standing effect mattered more, matters less now. I didn't talk about the distance, but you can see that the distance has always led to smaller gates for teams that are playing from further apart from each other, as you would expect. And roughly speaking, I think 10 miles would drop 1% off the gate, off the attendance. And then this is a variable put in to capture local games, so distances less than 10 miles between teams. You can see that this effect is also, like a lot of the other effects, getting smaller over time. It would add 40% up to the 1930s, 20% up to the 80s, and now it doesn't really appear to add much at all. We've got the holiday effect is a similar thing. The holidays used to add a lot more to the gate, and now things are falling. It's still significant at 5%, but it's nothing like as large an effect as it was. And then that's the lagged dependent variable, which moved from being smaller, 0.1, 0.2, up to 0.4 in the post-war era, and then is again falling down. And that's yet to fully make sense of that, because that's an argument against persistence. Whereas at the same time, we're noticing, I'm noticing with these other coefficients that the sensitivity of fans to things like whether the team's won, whether there's much interest, or whether it's a holiday, etc. All those kinds of things are declining in their sensitivity. My interpretation of that declining sensitivity, that we see here in terms of derby matches, winning, losing, is because over this period, season tickets became much more of a thing. So if you go back to the late 50s, most fans would turn up on the day and pay. I've looked at gate books from Preston North End, and everyone that's turning up just pays and goes in. But then over time, season tickets became a more common thing, where you'd buy a bundle of tickets in the summer for all the games of the following season. And then if you've got your ticket, maybe you're less sensitive. Maybe you don't take into account these kinds of shorter term fluctuations when you're making a decision about attending a game or otherwise. I'm not sure what this link's going to take us to. Oh, there we go. That's the effect of the league position. So again, home and away team. Home is black, away is red. The sensitivity to league position is also falling over time. Still matters, but it's less than it was back in the day. I put in measures of the local population, which vary over time because I've got census data back to 1881. And so I've got every census between 1881 and 1981. After 1981, I've got yearly population estimates for all the local area districts. And so I've got some kind of measure of the impact of the local population. I don't quite understand why these go completely flat and at zero over these two periods. You might say that corresponds with the two world wars, but I'm still not really sure why that would be the case. So I still need to think a bit more about that, but you can see that there was certainly there's been a varied effect of the local population on the attendances, the number of people turning out at football matches. So what to say? There's perhaps some evidence that looking over this long period of time, there's variation in strength to which the loss aversion effect dominates over the uncertainty of outcome effect. Most of the variables that I've put in there to kind of try and capture variations in why fans attend, they all tend to have shrunk in more recent years. And actually, that's one thing I meant to mention when I was talking about that. Part of the rationale for, there's all sorts of explanations for a season ticket. One is income smoothing by football clubs, because there's no football in the summer, so there's no income. And so get people to buy season tickets, and therefore you get some income in the summer months when there's no games taking place. But also in the period of certainly the 60s into the 70s, attendances were declining, and this was becoming more and more well known. And quite a few of the early sports economics papers that looked at English football, so I'm thinking the Sloan papers, I think in particular, make some reference to the fact that a lot of the revenues accrued by these teams are surprisingly resilient, despite the fact that numbers of people coming in is in quite significant decline. And so it may well be that the resilience of revenues is because of the fact that fans became more persistent in their attendance patterns over this time period, and perhaps that was driven by a stronger identity with teams, fan culture, home win preference, but also that effect of having a season ticket, of being able to buy a season ticket, perhaps. So I think we can learn an awful lot from lots and lots of match level data. And so what I've presented is a long look at these disaggregated data, attendances all over England, over 140 odd years. There doesn't tend to be much support for the uncertainty of outcome hypothesis, but there is support for other elements of uncertainty mattering. Seems to be evidence also of increased persistence in crowds as well. There's plenty I've still got to do with this, and I've just listed two things there, which I'm quite keen to think a little bit more about, which is the development of the supply of these arenas in which fans could go and watch, and something that again I've not really talked about much here. I put in whether a team was still in the FA Cup, and this is something that people have hypothesized, certainly sports historians, that being in the FA Cup was a measure of how interesting the season was still going to be. Perhaps this was back in the time when there wasn't much else going on. There wasn't European competition. There wasn't playoff competitions to sustain interest amongst fans of teams that were in the middle of the table. But the FA Cup was something that was argued would keep fans coming along. And once a team was deposited out of the FA Cup, they lost in that competition, their attendances would fall. That also, as an effect, shrinks as well over time. And I guess the FA Cup alongside the league is, and other cups as well, is an aspect of the competitive intensity in literature that has developed over the years. But I'm done, a couple of minutes over, my apologies for that. And now plenty of time for questions and comments, and I will reshare slides if need be. Jorge.
Hi, James. This is really cool work, and especially thinking about some data we have about Argentina. But no, not but. I mean, just a question. I mean, the role. I mean, the role of the Premier League. I think it has. I have a sense that if I ask right now, so what happened with the Premier League? Given your results, you have little to say because of the way you did it. And for instance, I would think that your persistence results are correlated with the fact that the Premier League started in 1991. If I saw the figure like that, so I don't know if just put a one start in 1991, or maybe think it a bit more about what it did. The other small comment is that maybe it would be interesting to divide the sample in a more historical manner, like before the First War, the interwar periods. Then you have this period that, with the exception of the 1960 World Cup, attendance fell. Then the Premier League, and maybe we can, or you can say something about that. Yeah, really cool paper.
Thanks, Jorge. Yeah, no, I think you're right to mention the start of the Premier League, because the Premier League is the only division where capacities are regularly hit of the stadiums, right? So I think if you probably look back, probably from about the mid-90s onwards, the teams that are there are always hitting their capacity. And so that's certainly an issue, because obviously then you've got attendances varying much less for everything else that's going on. So I think you're right to point that out. The only thing I would say is that that's one of the 5 divisions that I'm including, and so I mean, I guess that might explain some of the reduction in the sensitivity of the effects. I should probably run the regressions excluding the Premier League over the last few years and see if that changes anything. Yeah, I think that's absolutely a good point. Thank you. And dividing in a more systematic manner rather than just every 20 years, absolutely. I think that makes a lot of good sense. So thank you for that point as well. Alex.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. And coming back to the point of Jorge, so I'll take this opportunity to remind you what's happening with data on Argentina and England. Yeah, so I hope we'll be on it soon. So thank you, Jorge. And my well, actually, I have a stupid question probably. So when I think about it, if you want to investigate the effect of uncertainty of outcome by using, let's say, betting odds, and then you control for so many things after that, I'm always wondering, should you control for all those things, or should you only use like attendance as function of odds and odds squared? Probably it's a very stupid question, but I mean, when you over control for things, maybe you take away the real uncertainty of outcome from you kind of destroy these probabilities. I don't know. That's a question.
I don't think it's a silly question, Alex. I think it's a very good question. I think it does actually invite, me to look at a kind of, the usual thing where you put a small number of variables and then you expand, in a table to look at the effect of adding in more controls. I mean, the model that I'm estimating is the Humphrey-Gell model essentially, which has a league standing effect in there, and it has the home win preference and other things in there, and so that's kind of the basis for what I'm doing. But there's a very good case for saying, well, I had quite a lot of other things which can notionally come under the cost of attending, notionally come under the kind of the match day specific effects and so on, and there could be one or two of those is masking the effects of other things, not least the uncertainty of outcome. The way I kind of always think about it is I'd expect to see it there, right? I would expect that once you've controlled for the fact that I prefer my team to win, once you've controlled for the fact there's a match day experience, there's X, Y, and Z, what's left over, I always imagine, should still be, taking all that stuff into account, I probably do just about prefer, a more competitive match rather than one where the outcome is totally obvious. Because
let me just continue. Once you control for the ability of the team, like current position or last game or whatever, this is part of the probability of winning, isn't it?
Yeah. So that's obviously what the what that correction's all about. But obviously, I'm just subtracting off there the position rather than any of the other things that I put in. So you're right that perhaps I should correct for everything that I'm putting in the probability itself. I think that's a really good point. Thank you. And it's Pete next.
Oh, very interesting talk, James. This kind of builds off Jorge's idea. I noticed you created a long time series, and I've worked with time series economists who actually look for what are called structural breaks in the time series, and then you can go see if those structural breaks occur, like what Jorge said, post-war or something comes about, and that instead of arbitrarily choosing your time period, you can kind of get it built through a time series method. I don't do it myself, but I've worked with people who have.
Yeah, that's really, again, really interesting point. Thanks, Pete. I did quite a lot of my PhD back in the day on time series structural break detection methods. So yeah, they're out there and they exist.
Somebody else do
it. yeah. And seeing whether what might be picked up in terms of the change in the mean. To what
when I was looking at
corresponds.
your trends, sometimes they look like there's a break of some sort.
Yeah. So exactly. Certainly, there are structural changes over that time period, as you'd expect with world wars and all sorts of societal changes going on in that time period. So yeah, that's a really good point. Thanks, Pete.
Yep.
Daniele.
Yeah, hi James. Super interesting. Have a number of comments. I'll try to roll them off quickly. One thing, just to add more controls. Do you know time of day? I imagine that, like, was it a 3 p.m., 6 p.m., 8 p.m. kickoff? Maybe you don't have for historical data. It strikes me that is important. And my theory about decline in attendance in some leagues is that they have too many evening games that are, scheduled for primetime TV, but you don't want to go out at night or take your kids to a game at 9 p.m. So I at least for recent data, I think that would be interesting. You were talking about the hitting the capacity. Just a warning here: the capacity itself is endogenous, and I imagine that many stadiums have reduced capacity in recent years, where they've moved to all seating formats, and so that's just something to think about. One additional control: do fans value entertaining styles of play? So what if you control for average goals for plus average goals against, like teams that end up in a season they tend to have all 2-2s versus 0-0s. Maybe those will have sort of more attendance. And the last thing, and the main question is about the uncertainty of outcome. So I don't know what and I'm guessing that people here have thought a lot more about it, but my model of the world that there are like two types of fans. There are the diehard fans; they care only about their team winning. And then there are perhaps neutrals, and the neutrals maybe care about the uncertainty of outcome. And maybe the structural model should, and maybe the regression that you're running is already sort of taking the weighted average of those two preferences. But maybe it would be interesting to find a way to say, okay, what is the proportion of neutrals? What is the proportion of diehards? And I could imagine them having very different preferences. I don't know if there's an easy solution to that, but food for thought for people in this audience.
Yeah, thanks, Daniele. I guess to go through them in order. On the time of day, it's it's generally 3 p.m. on a weekend, 7:45, 8 p.m. On a weeknight. Holidays would be kind of 3 p.m. type game usually, and especially the further back you go. I mean, basically pre-Premier League, pre-1992, all games would have been 3 p.m.s and 7:45s basically, and then now you have a bit more variation, with Sky Sports having all these sorts of different kickoff times on different days to make sure that it can show the most number of games. But I think you're right. There's been quite a bit of that actually in the news recently about the choice of kickoff times by television companies. Liverpool played at Bournemouth, and the game didn't finish until after the last train left Bournemouth to get the fans back to Liverpool. And there's a similar thing for Chelsea and Man City on a Sunday evening a week or two ago. So I think it almost certainly matters. I could almost certainly proxy it for the olden days. And there's definitely sources of information for more recent years on the kickoff time as well. You're right about capacity being endogenous. Obviously, in the early days, it would have been the fact that these stadiums, as they were built, were being packed out, and so they were expanded. And it's interesting what you mentioned about capacities being reduced over time, and they certainly have been with stadiums becoming all-seater since 1992. But also my own team, the capacity is 13,500 in the stadium, but because of safety concerns, safety certificates, and so on, the game tomorrow only has an actual capacity of 11,700 because they can't put too many people in when there aren't enough sufficient exits for them to get out if there's an emergency and so on. So there are constraints that are even more subtle than necessarily knowing what their stadium capacity is. So yeah, absolutely. I like the point about style and lots of goals. Some part of me, though, I still think, going on to your fourth question about diehards, I am obviously a diehard, and I don't want to see an exciting game. I want to see my team win.
No, but you want to see your team win 4-0 every game.
Exactly. If I want to see 4 goals, I want them all to be in the other team's net, not 2 of them in my team's nets. And I imagine that over the time period, it must be the case that diehards became more of a fraction of the fans. When you read about how hooliganism developed in the 60s and 70s and the overall number of fans fell, you can imagine it was those with less strong preferences that stopped attending, and the ones that were the hooligans and the diehards were the ones that were still going along, and so they must have become a higher proportion. And maybe now there's some different balance between them. I've not given too much thought to how you might get at that, but that question of trying to think about different fan types is really interesting. I'd like to have information on, for example, the season ticket holders, because they're obviously a different type of fan than the person who buys a ticket for each game whenever they feel like going. And male, female fans, older fans, younger fans, and so on. All these kinds of things would be really interesting to get a sense at. But as yet, don't really have a clear way of doing that. But thank you, Daniele. Oh, hey.
Yeah, thinking about what you said, that you will go to a stadium and whatever, but what you really want is for your team to win. And I played in Spain in what would be third and fourth divisions, more or less, in my better years. But at the time, people went to the stadium, in these lower divisions. You have no idea of who you're playing with against. There's no uncertainty. Or better, there is full uncertainty. You really have no idea who's in the other. In time you get to know the players because there's a lot of mobility in these categories. So thinking about the pulling all the regression and stuff, I don't know if in first division, maybe in the 1940s, you actually know more or less Liverpool and Manchester and whatever. But before the war, the first war, still probably information was very low. Okay, so it would be like today playing against a rival from the fifth division, or today, not 30 years ago. Because even today, because of information, if you're in the fourth or fifth division, you kind of know something about the other. At least you know the standings. There was a point that you didn't even really know how the standings work. You had to be this formal thing and how to get that standing. And maybe one week they didn't go to the office and check the standings for that week, and that would happen. So full uncertainty, if you want to say it. But in terms of that, people would attend the game for any other reason other than uncertainty of the game. I don't know.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point, actually, Jorge, about the information known about the visiting team. You obviously know a bit about your team. And as you say, as you go down the league standings, it must be the case, or the divisions, it must be the case, your information becomes literally confined to the position of the opposition. I live here in a small town called Didcot, and they've got a football team. They're playing about the 8th division. And the only reason I know if a game's going to be interesting is if I see that their opponents are a similar position to them, or maybe they're at the top of the table or something. And it must have been like that. If you go back far enough, you guess, you say pre-First World War, you pick up the newspaper and you perhaps see what the league standings were, and you might read an article in the newspaper about what was expected, but then maybe the newspaper is trying to drum up interest in the game, and so maybe isn't giving you a totally accurate picture about how exciting the game would be. But yeah, I think the information about the away team is potentially really relevant, and that's obviously changing over time as well, as you say. So yeah, thank you. Any more questions and comments? In which case, we can finish. Thank you very much for attending. Our rearranged talk. We'll have Joel talk at some later point. And reminder as we go that before we meet next week, February the 29th is the deadline for the conference here in Reading. It isn't the most strict deadline in the world, but it'd be great to get your submission before then, just to help with planning purposes. And then March the 1st, next week, next Friday, is going to be a hybrid Roses talk. I've got Rob Simmons down in Reading with me from Lancaster University, and he's going to talk on do sports analytics affect player pay, evidence from new contracts. So thanks very much, everybody. Good to see you all. Look forward to seeing you all again next week.